last installment in my 3-part China video series is finally here. For those of you who haven't already, please check out videos 1 and 2. I'll put links somewhere up here. For those of you who did watch them, a quick recap. Part 1, we talked about the trade war, and I explained why I don't actually believe it should be called a trade war. And I explain also these concepts of things called finite and infinite wars and what that really means to these particular circumstances. Part 2, that's where we break down one of the biggest misconceptions about the relationship between the US and China, and that is debt. So now for part 3, here's what we're going to cover. We got to talk about Hong Kong. There's a lot there to unpack, and we need to explore what actually is going on and has been going on in Hong Kong and what it really means for mainland China and for the Communist Party of China. We're then going to talk a little bit about this very dystopian concept called the social credit system. We're going to then visit I got to be careful here. I'm going to have to call it a trade deal. It's phase 1. That's what the White House wants to call it. That's what other people are wanting to call it. Is it a trade deal? It depends. Finally, we'll wrap it up by revisiting a concept that we talked about in phase 1, or rather video 1, and that is the Belt and Road Initiative. There have been some pretty interesting developments around that, specifically Africa. So we'll talk about that and a little bit more coming right up. I'm Casey. Welcome to Uncommon Sensibilities. If you're new to the channel, please take a minute to hit the subscribe button, and everybody, hit the like button. If this is something that you find value in, if I bring some good information to the table, don't hesitate to give me a thumbs up down below, and share this video. Share this video with people that you know that may find this either interesting, entertaining, insightful, whatever it might be. I want to share the uncommon sense. I want to make it common again. And the only way we can do that is we've got to share good ideas, not just the emotional, attention-grabbing headline nonsense that so many people share on the various social media channels, etc. We got to be sharing good information with one another, and we've got to enlighten one another whenever possible. But to really kick things off, I've got to address the elephant in the room. It has been quite a while since I put out part 2 in this China series. And there's a reason that it took so long. Primarily, it has to do with topic 1 that we'll talk about today, which is Hong Kong. The Hong Kong unrest really kind of, it really blossomed right around the time I was filming what was going to be part 3 in this video series. And as I started to see things unfold, I didn't want to do a knee-jerk reaction and try to really cover it in that video because there would be no way that I would give you good quality information. I'm glad that I waited. A lot of really interesting things have come out of Hong Kong, and we've really seen just a almost peculiar scenario play out. And I'll talk about why that is so unusual. But as Hong Kong was unfolding, it just so happened that my wife, my daughter, and I were pleasantly surprised by the early arrival of my newborn son. So Jackson Lucas is now a healthy, happy member of our family. We couldn't be more elated. It's just such an incredible thing to have this beautiful little face as a part of our family. So we were lucky to get to see him a little bit early back in November, and then lo and behold, here come the holiday seasons. Things were just hectic, frantic, crazy, whatever it might be. And then, bam, lo and behold, here we are. It's 2020. We've got a trade deal. We've got, a Mexican beer company that really wishes their name wasn't in the news right now. And we've got a whole lot more coming out of China and the Sino-American relations that we need to talk about. So let's not waste any more time. Let's dive right into it. Hong Kong. We've got to explore this. So what do Hong Kong, Donkey Kong, and King Kong all have in common? I actually don't have a clue, but I know one thing's for sure. If you infringe on their liberties or their freedoms, they tend to get really angry and they can tend to be pretty destructive. In the case of Hong Kong, We've seen protests evolve or devolve, depending on how you look at it, into riots. We saw deaths. We saw vandalism beyond belief. But really what we saw unfold in Hong Kong, you've been bludgeoned with that in the news. That's not what I want to cover today. I don't want to cover what happened. I want to uncover or explore why these things came to be. And I want to explore what it is about the relations between Hong Kong and mainland China, what they can tell us about mainland China, about the Communist Party, about their intentions, their objectives going forward. And in order to do that, we need to talk a little bit about Hong Kong and sort of what they are, what they mean to mainland China. Just to quickly, sort of take a history lesson, I suppose. Hong Kong, as of 1842, was actually a territory of the British Empire. It wasn't until 1997, 23 years ago, that Hong Kong was given back to China. I know that sounds a little crazy, but that's really what happened. But in the agreement between Great Britain and China, the people of Hong Kong expected or demanded that a certain level of autonomy and a freedom that they effectively became quite used to, it had to be honored. So in the arrangement that Great Britain made with China, it was effectively about a 50-year agreement made that mainland China would respect Hong Kong as a special administrative area. It's kind of a silly terminology, but they've since kind of coined this idea of one country, two systems. And the two systems they're referring to are mainland China being under a communist, very almost hermit-like approach to global economics, or at least the engagement with the global economic sphere. And then there's Hong Kong, democratic, or what I like to call a diet democratic governmental system. It's not full democracy, it's diet democracy. But what the other aspect to this that's kind of unique is Hong Kong really operates in a free market capitalistic way. That's really the only way that it could have become what it is today, which is one of the major financial centers of the global finance marketplace. When I look at Hong Kong, something that I would maybe propose is that Hong Kong is kind of like a power adapter that you might use when you're traveling abroad. Hong Kong kind of plays that role for China. Because they have this capitalistic economic approach and this pseudo-free market kind of approach, Beijing and the Communist Party, mainland China, is able to sort of use Hong Kong as an adapter to plug into the rest of the global economic powers and the global economy. But you might be asking yourself, well, how can Beijing even use Hong Kong if they have their own kind of democracy, if they have their two systems? In order to understand that, what you really need to look at is how this diet democracy works in Hong Kong. And without getting into all the details, because out of respect for your time, it would just take way too long, please do take some time to go and look it up and better understand it yourself, because it's not only incredibly nuanced and it's not only incredibly complex, but to understand what actually goes on in Hong Kong and how Beijing is able to extend their reach, it's a pretty ugly tale. But where we stand right now, if I were to simplify it to the kind of brass tacks, you've got essentially something that we might consider to be similar to our electoral college. And in the case of Hong Kong, the Electoral College is made up of members who are representative of not only political ideologies or political parties, but also they've got business sectors and businesses that have their own representation. So that's kind of unique, of course, but where things get really kind of nasty or ugly is The protests in Hong Kong in 2019 are not the only protests in recent history. 2014 saw protests in Hong Kong, and the reason for that was, at that time, Beijing effectively reached into the democratic process in Hong Kong and effectively said, we're going to extend our grasp of power over you, and we're going to implement a policy that requires that the Communist Party and Beijing approve of any nominees that you might have that are going to run in your democratic process, in your democratic election process for what they call the chief executive. We would see that as president, for lack of a better word. The businesses, the business sectors, those who pledge their allegiance to Beijing and to the Communist Party and to the communist dictates, those companies, their wills, their wishes, those sectors, they're the ones whose candidates happen to just get the nod. They get the approval. That should be upsetting to anybody who doesn't know that. When we saw the news coverage unfold around Hong Kong, one of the biggest problems that we saw was that the media didn't care to recognize the fact that the current chief executive of Hong Kong, Carrie Lam, she's a product of this system. She is very close to Beijing, and anybody who wants to doubt that is not only being foolish, but what they're doing is robbing the people of Hong Kong of the justification in their protests, because they're basically having to live this very kind of vigilant, watchful, looking over your shoulder life at all times, because those very few bits of freedoms and liberties that they do enjoy, that they have enjoyed, that were promised to them, they're already being encroached on. And this is well before they should even be considered a threat. You know, this was a 50-year deal. It was only 23 years ago that was made. So that is something that should be concerning. Let's back up and let's just talk about what an extradition bill is. This is significant because ultimately the proposal of an extradition bill is really what catalyzed the protests. And in this case, what we were seeing is an extradition bill that was being proposed that would allow for mainland China to extradite perceived criminals from Hong Kong who may have been seeking asylum or safety or whatever it might be in Hong Kong, or perhaps they were Hong Kong citizens who maybe were going against the rule of law in mainland China, but maybe not going against the rule of law in Hong Kong. And that's a key piece here. So to back up again and just to cover what an extradition bill is, the idea of extradition bill is an agreement between two governments, two countries, whatever it might be, that would allow one to remove an individual from the other in the event that individual had committed a crime in the first country or in the party that's looking to bring them back. So the real heart of the issue with Hong Kong and the protests is the imposition of this extradition bill, but more specifically, it's twofold. One is this idea of setting a precedent. This particular bill really would have set a significant precedent for the people of Hong Kong. And two, this is a story about controlling the narrative. This is a story about powers that be insisting upon the need to control the sharing of information and ensure that it fits the narrative that they want to present or portray. It's no secret that transparency is not a pillar of Chinese governmental policy. China is notorious for being really, I would say, for lack of a better word, a hermit nation in terms of their sharing of information. Not just globally, though, but internally. There is a lot to be said for the idea of controlling the masses by way of disinformation, misinformation, lack of information, and generally ensuring that ideas are not capable of being spread. To illustrate my point about China not exactly being a huge fan of freedom of information or freedom of ideas, there's no better way to do it than to introduce you to a good friend of mine, Winnie the Pooh. He happens to be a really good friend of my daughter's. And this slow-witted, fun-loving, honey-loving little bear, he's a delight for kids not only in America, but where he was originally thought up in England. A.A. Milne's beloved character, he's really something, but he's not exactly what I would consider to be a controversial character. However, he's completely censored in China. And he's censored because they have what is called the Great Firewall of China. It's effectively a government-run operation that is a system of both people and artificial intelligence or algorithmic-based web intelligence that it blocks any information that they care to block. So why is Winnie the Pooh censored in China? Well, it just so happens that some rather perceptive bloggers recognize that there's an uncanny resemblance between the little yellow bear and the glorious supreme leader, Xi Jinping of China. Now, I have to be honest, there's an uncanny resemblance. So credit to those who came up with this little parallel here. But this whole thing started after a now almost infamous handshake between Shinzo Abe, who is the Prime Minister of Japan, and Jinping, when they had I would say, less than successful meeting between the two. And you can see here, this one really knocks it out of the park. It's the juxtaposition of Eeyore and Pooh. In this case, it captures everything. It's easy to laugh at and honestly enjoy this or the comedy in this, but the reality of it is that this isn't a laughing matter for the people in China. Beijing's objective of wish to control the narrative and to obfuscate facts whenever possible to benefit their own agenda. This is rampant in China. Dissent in general is so highly monitored and prosecuted. There are some other, really sad and unfortunate cases, and I'd encourage you, take the time to look those up as well, of individuals who did speak out against the government and, as they say, they got disappeared. This should be a concern, but it's not in this case, as I mentioned, this isn't just something that affects the people of China. Let's just look very kind of current event related, coronavirus. It was just 2 days ago, 3 days ago, whatever it was, that we saw this leap in reported cases, and there'd been speculation that more likely than not, the number of cases reported was not an accurate figure. This is no secret. This is being controlled. The narrative is being controlled by Beijing to fit what they want the world to see and what they need the world to see in order to operate their agenda effectively. So this extradition bill imposed by Beijing, by mainland China, over Hong Kong, there's no other way to put it. This was, yes, a power grab, but this was a power grab for one specific purpose: to silence the dissent and ensure that the information spread to the world was what Beijing wants it to be, not what it probably really is. No, this power grab is not just limited to Hong Kong. Something that seemed to have flown completely under the radar, some of you may be familiar with it, but it really didn't catch any it didn't catch the American zeitgeist in any way, is there was an election in Taiwan. Now, Taiwan's another very unique region in the greater China sphere. in the interest of time, again, I'm not going to get into all the history, but what you need to know is, as a byproduct of, believe it or not, a civil war in China, and coincidentally a civil war that occurred or coincided with the Second World War. And I think that's something that's just so often left out of the history books, that this was something occurring there at that time. But Taiwan and the people of Taiwan basically claimed a sense of independence. They are the Republic of China, whereas mainland China is the People's Republic of China. Emphasis on the communism. But Taiwan has recognized themselves as independent. Generally speaking, the rest of the world recognizes them as independent. But mainland China does not. Mainland China still asserts or officially recognizes them as a part of China. Now, they too have democracy, and I would say they have a greater sense of democracy than do the people of Hong Kong. But in January this year, 2020, they had a major election. They had a presidential election, and it came on the heels of some kind of political turmoil. There was stepping down of president. There was a couple of other things that occurred. But long story short, the president that stepped down, the incumbent candidate, won, and she won handedly. She ended up taking 60% of the vote, which was 20% more than the next candidate running, and there was more than 2 candidates running. 3 primary candidates, there were others, but she took 60% of the vote. That's a big deal, and that's a big statement, and the big statement it makes, this is a punch to Beijing's gut. And the reason for that is the incumbent president ran on a very firm platform of anti-Beijing, anti-China. She had no interest in increasing ties with China. She had no interest in accommodating or catering to or pandering to China. She wanted to assert to the people of Taiwan that she would insist on Taiwan's independence in every facet of the word. Her opponents, however, while none of them actually proposed that there would be a rejoining with China, or I would even consider it a reabsorption, they did all have in their platforms some form of increasing the relationship with mainland China. The people of Taiwan rejected this handedly. That says something. Again, if Hong Kong and the people of Hong Kong are rejecting this idea of the power grab by mainland China, if mainland China continues to not only look to grab back power from another massively powerful economic region, Taiwan, they're also reaching out to Hong Kong, a massive economic power, a financial center of the world. And they're trying to bring them in under their umbrella, under their control. And the people in these territories, in these regions, in these areas are saying, no, we want nothing to do with it. Not only should it tell Americans this whole concept of socialism from the people, from the horse's mouth, from the people that are there, that have seen it firsthand, they want nothing to do with it. So we should be learning a lesson here, but of course we're not. But the other thing that we are able to see is another fracture occurring in mainland China, in the Communist Party of China's overall agenda and their plan. Because what they're doing in their attempt to assert power over others is they're really uncovering some of the significant weaknesses in their policy and in their approach. I'd like to use kind of a little analogy here where let's take, for example, a draft horse. These are huge, very strong horses. These are beasts. Let's assume that said draft horse is born in a barn, born in a farm environment, raised to pull a cart, a wagon, or whatever it might be. So long as that horse continues its life, generally speaking, it's pretty happy. Generally speaking, it's a pretty content horse. It's well fed. Let's say it's cared for very, very well, in fact. I mean, let's just assume that It's living a good life. There becomes an issue, though, if that horse is exposed to, in an unlikely scenario, a wild stallion running freely in a pasture. Now all of a sudden that horse sees the other way that you can go about things, the other way that its own life could unfold. Now, if it were to look out into a pasture and see a wild hare running, it may not necessarily see anything. There may not be a connection there. It's too different. But when it sees that wild stallion running, now it's saying, that's a horse, I'm a horse. I've got this wagon tied to me. Yeah, my life's pretty good, but boy, that looks really good. That's a really dangerous thing. If we were to say that the farmer or the horse owner is China, the people of China, this massive, powerful machine in the case of China, let's say that's the draft horse. The wild stallion might just be Hong Kong. The wild stallion might just be Taiwan. People that are so similar in so many different ways. They may even have family members that are in both places. They've got access to the technologies, and they've got the ability to use the technologies to communicate in mass. China has to do their best to ensure that the blinders are kept on their draft horse. They cannot let their draft horse see just what freedom might look like, because if they don't, they've got a happy, and I'm being a little bit hyperbolic here, but a happy, content workforce that's relishing in all the benefits of this communal effort towards economic power. Nobody's seen just how lavish and nice and cushy the life of those leading the communistic movement. Nobody's seen that, right? They just assume it is what it is, and whatever it might be. But if you end up getting a glimpse of what that freedom that stallion's experiencing is, that becomes a real danger to the farmer, because that horse is way more powerful than the farmer. And if that horse wants to run bad enough, it's gonna run. So that farmer now can't control where that wagon goes. Okay? That's really what this fight is all about. Now the hare in this case, America, England, plenty of other countries. So it's not that necessarily the Chinese government has to ensure that their people don't see the Western world. It's too different. It's too disconnected. It's too dissociated. In fact, seeing that, in many cases, we've seen that it almost kind of builds that sense of pride in the people of China. There's sort of a us versus you. Where that pride is broken is when, again, there's something that's just similar enough that knows that taste of freedom, that knows what freedom feels and looks like. If that thing is what plants the idea inside of the draft horse, that's where the real problems for Beijing start to unfold. So that's why they're going for this power grab. That's why they're trying to silence, by way of extradition bill, Hong Kong, or reabsorb this, look at some clothes that you have, look at things that are made. There's made in China, there's made in Taiwan, okay? These are economic players in a large way. They want to be sure that they can control and manipulate the narrative by way of these. And then there's actually a third sibling in this, and that's Macau. And that's a conversation for another day. So we're not even going to touch on that. But hopefully you can now see why this extradition bill, why the Hong Kong events are so meaningful and impactful, not for Hong Kong alone, but for Beijing. And hopefully by bringing up Taiwan, maybe you're a little bit more educated on what's actually happening, because those kinds of things just really aren't getting the traction that they need to be, because they do mean a lot, not only for China in this case, but for the global economy. It's one thing to simply cut off a population from worldly points of view or opposing narratives, compelling dissent, etc. But as North Korea, Joe McCarthy, Scientology, Genghis Khan, if they've shown us anything, a self-policing population is a compliant population. The mere threat that you cannot trust anyone as they're able to report you and your activities, that's a highly effective means for quashing revolution before it can even start. It's also a wildly effective means of gathering exhaustive amounts of data and information about people. And better yet, what if in addition to people reporting behavior of others, you could employ an arsenal of advanced machines to join in? I'm talking machines with eyes that are capable of recognizing faces, eyes that watch all the time, eyes that exist everywhere, all reporting back to a centralized database. Believe it or not, I'm not referring to the NSA or the FBI or any form of American surveillance, but while we do have significant issues with privacy infringement, compared to what the Chinese citizens are up against, we lead more private lives than the Collier brothers. And that's a deep cut, so if you get some time, go look it up. But China's social credit system, as plain as I can put it, is one of the scariest notions that I can currently fathom. Essentially, they're implementing a nationwide integrated database and monitoring system that's operated by the state and its various divisions, military, police, etc. And in this, they catalog a wide array of data points on all citizens, and then a score is assigned to the citizens. And this is in turn used to essentially dictate the ease of life. Think Big Brother, but more like conjoined twins Big Brother. Perhaps it sounds somewhat innocuous, and it maybe even sounds familiar to us. I mean, after all, we do have a credit score system. And yes, that has devolved into a government-sponsored privacy invasion of its own kind. But for now, we're not subjected to this. Rewards for praising the government on social media, increasing your score for praising the government, or punishment or getting deductions from your score for insincere apologies for crimes committed, or cheating in online games. Oh, and here's a fun one. It's not even listed here. Picking up after your pet. Yep. You better not forget the pooper scooper when you take Fido on a walk. These rewards and punishments should be cause for alarm for anyone who has even the slightest respect for human liberties, regardless of ideology, creed, culture, anything for that matter. But in the case of the social credit system, the most egregious part of this is the subjectivity of it. Not to mention that these are the public-facing rules for playing the twisted game. There's no way of knowing what kind of internal rules, metrics, or even algorithm-based evaluations that are going on behind the scenes. It is speculated that this tool has already been aggressively used against the Chinese Muslim population known as the Uyghurs or Uyghurs. So religion isn't out of the question. That could also be considered part of this credit system. Beijing's enforcement comes by way of facial recognition, surveillance, AI-powered smart glasses used by the police, they have drones, digital billboards that are dedicated to shaming the offenders. They will put the face of the offenders on these billboards and publicly shame them. I'm going to put some links down below for some of the more in-depth articles specifically about this horrifying reality. But, for our sake, to quote either Billy Mays or one of the other as seen on TV personalities, but wait, there's more, something that we also need to be considerate of is, maybe you're familiar with the company Huawei. Maybe you heard of them because they are the largest manufacturer of telecommunication technologies globally. Maybe you've heard of them because they're the daughter of the founder, Meng Wanzhou, I believe is how it might be pronounced. She was arrested by the Mounties up in Canada, specifically Vancouver, at the behest of the United States. And significant charges brought against her, but that was at the end of 2018. It sort of made a buzz, and then it seemed to kind of dissipate. A lot of complications there. Maybe you've even recently heard of Huawei because of a kind of an unusual spat between the British Prime Minister Boris Johnson and Trump, who in many ways have been kind of seen as sort of two peas in a pod, but they had a recent kind of hashed out a little bit of a spat because Trump was condemning the United Kingdom or England, Great Britain generally, but the Prime Minister here of contracting with Huawei because of the implementation of 5G. But if you're an American, I know one way you didn't learn about this story or this company, and that's through any retail store of any kind. And that's because the United States has banned the company from the US. And this move has a lot more to it than just a little trade spat. I mentioned when talking about the Hong Kong elections that companies that are closer in ties with their, or closer in terms of allegiance to Beijing, they have greater political pull. Well, in mainland China, this is just amplified immensely. And the founder of Huawei, he has very close ties to the Communist Party. And he has a history with the Chinese military. So it's no surprise that the company is closely tied to, if not directly in the hands of the Communist Party. As I mentioned, they are banned in the US, and this is due to being deemed a national security threat. There have proven to be significant threats of Huawei using various methods to conduct espionage on behalf of the Communist Party. Now, these claims have severely ramped up with their role as there's a global implementation of the 5G technologies, and they've been a big player in this globally. Again, England or Great Britain with regards to Trump and Boris Johnson. And while this is all a topic worth exploring on its own, I bring Huawei into the context of our discussion, specifically around the social credit system, because according to the International Data Corporation, this single company, Huawei, they own 21.3% of the domestic Chinese smartphone market. And as of the fourth quarter of 2018, they had year-over-year growth of 23.3%. That's only smartphones. That has no bearing on other network technologies, infrastructure, etc. And if this company has such close ties to the Communist Party and is accused globally of using their technology for espionage, it would be difficult to dismiss the notion that Beijing is leveraging this access to the citizens for a number of purposes that may not be so savory. The American people owe it to ourselves to better understand our own circumstances, but also take advantage of the opportunity to witness this atrocious experiment that Beijing is conducting on its people and learn from it, so we don't invite that same fate into our system. But, as I smile, I also bring this up to highlight another reason for optimism, as it relates to the power struggle between the US and China on an economic basis. This type of Brave New World tactic, it breeds and fosters another foundational crack in China's economic future: homogeny. In an ironic twist of poetic justice, there's a highly probable scenario in which this sadistic method of control for the sake of planned advancement, it essentially cements China as the factory automatons of the world. Homogeny stifles creativity. It stifles ingenuity and chance. Some of humanity's greatest innovation and inventions resulted from a disagreement. There's this kind of offering of a different point of view that comes from that odd couple who complement one another so well that the weakness of one is bolstered by the strength of the other. And if the government defines what is societally accepted or preferred and has this strict guideline that then in turn rewards those who look, act, and think all the same, a problem for one is going to be a problem for all. One man's trash will be another man's trash. And meanwhile, the potential treasure that lies in that will be shipped off to the landfill. Now, excuse me for a minute while I get all proud American on you, but the very thing that fosters so much anger, hatred, vitriolic attacks here in the United States is the very thing that makes America so damn great. It's our diversity. We think better than most any other nation. We invent, we innovate, we elevate one another. It may not be obvious, but our differences in race, creed, religion, height, weight, whatever it is, the difference, It pushes us to see what we otherwise couldn't. We balance one another. But even this is not a viewpoint shared by all of us. Just look at the homogeneous culture crisis occurring in Silicon Valley. Therein lies a ticking time bomb, as the lack of political diversification and ideological diversification, it's a risk just as much as this insistent need for or mandate for diversification for the apparent overt physical attributes. They don't focus on the diversity of minds and talents. They focus on physical diversity. And that's not always going to be not only beneficial, but in most cases, and as we're seeing right now, you're getting a hive mind. You're getting this echo chamber, because even though the people look a lot different, they all think the same. And that is where the real problem exists. Now, at least for now, we're still benefiting from our diversity, and which is why we sell and export more ideas than any other product. Ideas are our major export, and they're our highest value export. But Houston, we've got a problem. Now, let's sidestep for a minute and just imagine that you're a small business owner. How difficult would it be to make a living if the product you sell were stolen from your warehouse before you could even get it on your shelf? Now, yes, there's ways to prevent this, or at least hinder it with security protocols, or maybe your product is a 10-ton safe. Okay, that's a difficult product to steal. But how difficult is stealing an idea? I would suggest that it's far easier to steal than it is to prevent from being stolen. And boy howdy, what a convenient segue that is. Okay, so January 2020, we got phase one of a trade deal. So I mentioned, from the last segment, that sort of idea of kind of pretend you're a small business owner. And I'm going to hit on that because that's really the main takeaway from the trade deal, or the implications of the trade deal. But before I get into that, I think it's important to highlight there are some decent things that were involved in this trade deal. There are also some decent or significant things that are missing. But the long and short of it, and I think the real problem with this trade deal and why it was pretty well received by the market in general, but it's heavily predicated on promises. The United States published via the White House the implications or the included components of the trade agreement. And from the United States side, in terms of concessions, the main concession that the United States agreed to is there was about $120 billion worth of imported goods from China that the United States had imposed a tariff on back in September of 2019, so not that long ago. If you were to think of inventories, LIFO, last in, first out, that's kind of how the United States has addressed their tariff policy. And what they've done is that block of 120 billion of imports, it was subject to a 15% tariff. And the agreement was that they would reduce that in half to 7.5%. Okay, so it's a big concession in the sense of cutting this large tariff in half. But in reality, as I've said with Trump and the Trump administration, and you're going to start seeing this a lot this year across all political parties, there's a really important tactic that they're starting to see, that not only they're seeing it work. And that is manufacture problems that you can solve. This is not a new tactic, but it's a tactic that Trump has employed very successfully through his presidency. And even though the people that are so violently against him, they're not exempt from using tactics that he's using, good or bad, irrelevant. The point is that you have to be thoughtful of is a problem that somebody's solving a real problem, or is it a problem that they created so they can solve it? It's the person that, they catch you on the ledge and they joke with you and they grab you by the shoulders and shake you real fast and they go, oh, I just saved your life. No, you didn't. You potentially put me at risk of falling off a cliff and then you pulled me back. So you created a problem and then solved it. You didn't save my life, okay? We cut these tariffs. We cut them in half, but we created the tariffs not that long ago. So we really didn't give up much, but we did give up a penalty. Now, to backtrack very quickly, when the tariffs were first imposed, or when this trade, again, skirmish, spat, I don't want to call it a war, but when this trade thing started, I didn't agree with Trump in the means by which he and his administration sought to affect change. But the fact that the Trump administration finally took a position that was very direct, very straightforward, and addressed China over a matter that we as the United States and most other developed economies that are large players in the global economic space, what we weren't addressing, and that is everyone was treating China with the kid gloves that you might treat an emerging economy, that you might treat a very small economy, where you turn a blind eye to some practices that, while they are harmful to the United States, truth be told, it's one of those, look, it's growing pains. Or, it's kind of the same way that we would look at like a teenager who makes a big mistake. We expunge the record at 18. There's, for most cases, there's something to be said for that. There's something to be said for that growing process, that learning process. However, once you turn a certain age, we've agreed that 18 seems to be a viable age. You can argue that brain development doesn't really, end until you're in your early 20s. So maybe that should be lifted. Meanwhile, you've got a lot of people pushing to reduce the voting age. Subject again for another day. But while we, say, okay, you're an adult when you're 18, the global economy hadn't effectively set many parameter that said China's a big player. China's just as big, if not bigger than the rest of us. They're as mature, if not, they're acting as mature as the rest of us. Why do we still treat it as though it's this emerging economy? Why do we still turn a blind eye to practices that are harmful to the rest of the world, currency manipulation and some others? And really, that's what I commend the Trump administration for doing, is they finally faced this thing head on. And even though, again, the means by which they tried to affect change, I don't agree with tariffs. I don't think that that's the proper policy. What I do agree with is they took action. So it takes some of the bite out of it, takes some of the sting out of it. But again, the United States has conceded to drop tariffs on not all of the goods that we currently have tariffs imposed on. There's still 250 billion or so that are still subject to a 25% tariff. But for this last set that was, again, enacted in September, for this last set of goods, this 120 billion worth, we're going to cut it from 15 to 7.5. What did China do in return? What is the other side of this conversation? They did a few things. But again, as I mentioned, most of it was lip service. Most of this was a commitment. None of this was enforceable. None of this was placed in a signed agreement. The agreement was that these things would happen, and if they don't, some type of enforcement would be agreed upon. Future tariffs, whatever it is. So that's the biggest detriment to this whole thing, and that's why I still get a little wishy-washy when I think, is this really a trade deal? Because it's missing some of those critical pieces. But what they have verbally or acknowledged, the agreement that they've made is, and I'm going to make sure that I get all the figures correct here, within the next 2 years, they have pledged to increase the purchase of U.S. goods and services by $200 billion. Now, here's a catch to that. Prior to imposing these tariffs and again, prior to sort of starting up this trade skirmish, the Trump administration's initiation of this, the United States was really only exporting directly to China something to the tune of $130 billion a year. So a pledge to increase by $200 billion is more than doubling the pre-existing kind of rate, the pre-existing flat standard. So that's a large commitment, which again, enforceability is minimal. It's lacking, to say the least. That makes me a little suspect. I'm not a big fan of seeing big radical changes over short periods of time, especially when you're talking about countries, especially when you're talking about very large players. This is something that's not only very difficult to enact. Granted, yes, when Beijing makes a pledge to buy something because of their communist approach to government, they can kind of enforce it if they wanted to. Whereas in the U.S., if a president says we're going to buy something, they can't really go and tell each and every individual company you have to do this. There's ways that they could persuade them, but generally speaking, it's pretty far-fetched to think that kind of promise is going to be upheld. So maybe we shoot for, what is it the same? We shoot for the stars, we settle on the moon, that's a little bit closer. We still end up getting out of the atmosphere. We shoot for 200 billion, maybe they increase purchases of US goods and services by, 50 million. It's 50 million more than they were. There's a pro there, but I'm not going to hold out a lot of hope in that space. Now, secondly, on the docket for China is they have pledged to refrain from competitive manipulation of their currency. And they've also pledged, and this is actually a big one if this one's followed through on, because we've talked a lot already about the kind of controlling the narrative, the control of information, not only within China, but the information that is allotted to the world to kind of view from the outside looking in. But they have pledged that they are going to effectively publish relevant data on exchange rates and external balances. This doesn't currently exist. There's no reliability to it. That's shadow banking. That's a lot of the things that make it very difficult for the rest of the global financial space. So a pledge to not manipulate currency for the benefit of China to the detriment of the rest of the world. Currency manipulation still exists. I mean, the kind of, again, this is where I'm going to have to just call hypocrisy where it exists. Trump in his first few years, he especially on the campaign trail was really he felt like strong dollar policy was this, requirement. And then once he starts to, it seems, better understand the Fed or whatever it was all of a sudden, we need a weak dollar. We need to be more competitive globally. So he's trying to kind of impose some currency manipulation on the markets, whether or not it's direct or indirect. It's same thing. It's a different thing. It's it's the same, but it's different in a sense because of how our political systems are structured. But there is definitely some hypocrisy there. So I'm going to call it as it is. There's no doubt about that. You can't ignore that. But if we can get this from China, that actually is a really good thing because, as I've highlighted in other videos, the currency manipulation, I think it was in part 2, talked about the currency manipulation and the effect that it had on the markets in 2016 when you had this overnight devaluation and the ripple effect that it sent through the markets. And, that can be really detrimental, not only to, an investor, but to global marketplace, especially with China being as large as they are. So those are the two pieces from China. The third piece, financial services. They're pledging, again, to open up the financial services to the rest of the world so that other external parties can come in and play ball in their market. I really, that's a tough one for me because there's part of me that I fear what it could do to the financial services companies that seek to, let's say that's something that's upheld by China. Okay. And now all of a sudden, certain financial services companies want to play in that arena. What types of concessions are they going to make to appease the government to better position themselves? Now, again, if you agree with me that a free market has a kind of a self-righting mechanism, it just takes time. It's not usually within one single lifetime. the more free the market is, if they're doing things that are not agreeable to the rest of the world, the company will eventually suffer. However, where things could get ugly is like what we see with the film industry. This has kind of become an easy target for criticism. Disney's taken a lot of criticism with their Marvel universe, modifying characters like in Doctor Strange, who in the comic series is of a certain ethnic descent and is of a certain gender, and that didn't quite fit what the Chinese would allow, so they changed it to a Celtic descent female. Okay, now there's other things that went into that, but that was a big part of why that character was changed from the comic book to the movie. You're seeing things like in the parks, whereas and again, I'm going to use Disney because I know a little bit more about it, but you have a haunted mansion in Disneyland and Disney World, in the Magic Kingdom at Disney World, but in Disneyland, that is really the attraction. But in China, they modified it to an enchanted mansion because of how the Chinese view certain things. That's more of a cultural appeasement, which I can respect that. But when you're doing things like what the film industry is doing, which is appeasing a governmental standard in order to ensure that you make more money there, I'm going to get a bit more critical there. I'm going to get a bit more critical because, again, these values that we believe in, this idea of free thought, free expression of opinion and idea, and to cater to that government's insistence that not be the case, for the sake of a buck, it gets a little wishy-washy. So what does that mean for the financial services industry? What kind of things will they potentially concede to, or where are they going to find their own agreements or deals, and what ripple effect will that have on the rest of the financial markets? It's to be seen, but that's, again, assuming that China actually follows through on this agreement. Because of their strength that they're gaining in their, in most cases, predatory loan marketplace through like Africa and other Belt and Road Initiative countries of influence, their own financial services and financial industry is doing quite well. So it affords them the opportunity to not protect them in the same fashion. So they may actually follow through on this. I don't know, but that was something that they pledged to. And the last one, the fourth piece of this agreement that is, I think, the most important for us to focus on is what I alluded to in my little scenario of having your goods stolen out of your warehouse before they make it to the shelves. If you're the small business owner, it's the intellectual property. It's that thing that America is so damned good at. We make good ideas. We produce good ideas. Our diversity allows for that. Our diversity in cultural backgrounds, our melting pot of cultures, and the fact that is becoming more embraced. The fact that people want to come here to escape communism and socialism. It should not fall on deaf ears here. There's a reason that people want to get away from those and come here, is because they can express their ideas and they can hear the other points of view and they can engage in a marketplace that effectively rewards having a differing point of view. We have all these ideas, these inventions, these technologies, and China has a remarkable way of somehow finding themselves with those exact same ideas and getting them to market quicker, cheaper, more efficiently. Well, that's what you would consider intellectual property theft. That's been a real big sticking point for this whole conversation. Now, in the trade agreement, China has pledged to crack down on this. I can't help but laugh inside when I see that, because we know for a fact that the Communist Party sponsors a lot of this. Now, I've vacillated on whether or not I even want to include a deep discussion about some of the practices, and I've decided for now, because this is going to be enough of a discussion as it stands, I'm going to leave out the deep dive. But what I want to highlight is the fact that just within the past few weeks, you've seen some significant arrests made by the Department of Justice and some charges filed against a number of people that are not just of Chinese descent. They're not Chinese nationals. The I guess most famous, or what would be the standout case is a Harvard professor and basically the chief of a department in chemistry. He was arrested on charges that not only are potential intellectual property theft charges, but just simply general espionage charges. And how they're presented, we're going to find more and more out as time goes on, but the surface level understanding that has been provided to the public is that effectively this individual was receiving and not reporting a healthy amount of compensation from the Chinese government to conduct research in China. This professor being arrested, having taken what some have called bribery money, but really what this is something that China's been doing aggressively around the globe, and that is they'll come to somebody who has a significant knowledge base in an area or an expertise that they may not. And they'll say, we'll give you massive compensation. You come do research here. You come do research for us. You won't have the red tape. You won't have the bureaucracy. You won't have to deal with all the crap. You can just do your research. Okay, here's a problem. Thomas Edison is often chastised for stealing the inventions of many of the people that worked for him. Part of the reason for that is that Thomas Edison's credited with inventing so many things when in fact, just like Westinghouse and some of the others, they're given credit for inventing it, but in reality it was their employees that spawned these ideas, that developed them, that created them. In the case of China, if you're working for them and you're doing research for them, they own it. They own you. They own your research. They own what you find. So while you might be completely, just dedicated to your craft, to your art, you don't really care so much about how much you're being compensated. You're just simply being told, look, I can be provided a way to give my family food on the table and a roof over their head. And in the meantime, I get to pursue this thing that I can't pursue in America or elsewhere because there's too many restrictions. There's the FDA, there's the, whatever other CDC or whoever, whatever it is. And I've got this great idea and I just need to break through. Now, I'm no huge fan of over-regulation, but I'm also not a huge fan of a government saying, come over here, here, do it for us, and we won't give you any trouble. But we're also, anything that you find is ours. No wonder we're not going to give you trouble, because worst case scenario is you find something we don't like and we just throw it away. Best case scenario is we find something you like and we just take it from you. Well, that's really troublesome, okay? That's intellectual property theft on a different level. That's intellectual property theft on a level that includes espionage, that includes, and as this case is provided for us, apparently there was a pretty decent amount of access that they had to certain critical databases in the United States that we didn't grant access to China for, but this gentleman did. That can be troublesome. That can be a problem. But then there's also that whole other leg, which is where, again, there were other cases that were reported at the same time where you have effectively Chinese nationals that are infiltrating our not only education system. There's a woman who was apparently Chinese military, very well trained in a number of different schools of, be it highly technologically proficient, but also in various forms of espionage, who was effectively stealing significant research information and sending it back to China. And there are a few other cases, which I do think all Americans need to be aware of this. This one kind of flew under the radar. And finally, and where, it's almost like this beautiful little bow that just gets put on top of this whole conversation, and that is Attorney General Barr released an announcement just, I believe it was about a week and a half, 2 weeks ago, and I'll put a link to this one down below. They've charged Chinese, what are presumed to be Chinese military members with the Equifax data breach, the major, significant infiltration of and hack of Equifax, which is one of the credit reporting bureaus, which is a misnomer. We really should not call them bureaus, but we do. And that just harkens back to the idea that they're effectively government-sponsored invasion of privacy. Even though they're not government entities, they're private or publicly held companies, depending. But that was the largest data breach in our history to date that we are aware of. And again, this is by a company that we do not give consent to aggregate and track this data. We may benefit in some ways from the service that they provide, but we did not grant them authority to aggregate this data individually. And it's presumed that China is the responsible party. Now, whether there's any truth in this, we will find out. But the fact that that charge has been dropped, or rather that charge has been issued, to me, it kind of goes back to, in this trade agreement, all I'm seeing is promises. I'm not seeing anything in hard print. That gives me a little bit of hesitancy to get too excited about it. I'm seeing that maybe the enforcement side from the U.S. is getting stronger. They're willing to finally file these cases, file these suits against these individuals who are conducting or partaking in this intellectual property theft. But the real killer is these are just the cases that you find out about. It's happening all over the place, and we're just talking real big top level intellectual property theft. It has nothing to do with the little dongle or whatever it might be, the little widget that a small business owner, American, invents. Says, I'm going to take this to market, the cat scratch pad or whatever the heck it might be, something silly, that next thing you know, they're producing it because they're wanting to, have it manufactured by the U.S. And whether that's good or bad, it doesn't really matter. You want to have it manufactured somewhere else, have it manufactured somewhere else, if that's your thing. But all of a sudden, that particular product, which was protected by the U.S., happens to show up very cheaply in a Chinese marketplace and then finds its way onto a U.S. retailer. And now that individual really just has no basis for competition. The free market would say, tough cookies. There's a part of me that agrees. Tough cookies. That's the heart and nature, the harsh reality of competition. But the other side of it is simply the fact that it is endorsed by the government. That's where I really have a hang up. It's endorsed by, it is propagated by the Communist Party. It's then used against the United States and against other nations. That's where the real hang up is. And that's where, when I get this kind of promise coming from them, I have a very difficult time believing it. So, more on that in future iterations. We're going to see how things play out. But I think that right now it's important to know what the trade deal was. It's important to be aware of where the concessions were for the United States and whether they really existed. And then it's also worth recognizing the implications of again, enforcement when it comes to these kinds of agreements. And right now it's pretty soft. But links are down below for this one. And last of all, where I'm going to really close this entire series up is I'm going to go full circle back to the very beginning. And I want to do a couple updates on the Belt and Road Initiative, because I think that it is increasingly important that we prepare for and become more aware of the tactics that are being used by China and how we can better position ourselves going forward. All right, I know this has been a long journey, and I recognize that while it took some time to cover all these various topics, in reality, I've only just begun to scratch the surface on the relationship between these two major economic powers, the United States and China. But what better way, as I mentioned, to wrap up this entire kind of conceptual understanding than to revisit one of the most significant topics from the very first in this three-part series, and that is the Belt and Road Initiative. Specifically, I want to discuss how that initiative is targeting Africa as the primary tool in advancing Beijing's goals and objectives with the Belt and Road Initiative. When I first covered this topic, I outlined the importance that Africa plays in the Chinese strategy and the repercussions of the influence that China is having on Africa. Since then, however, there seems to be a growing public awareness of this reality here in the U.S. It is interesting to me that this seems to finally be gaining some traction right now while the U.S. is engaged or amidst this continued trade conflict with China, and that we're entering an election year. Part of what I want to bring to your attention is that this very issue, it may become a major part of the election rhetoric. Once the Democrats choose their candidate and the partisan mudslinging really begins, this is going to be something that I think we're going to see more of. The newness of this concept, while it's not new at all, it may serve as great political fodder to be used and manipulated to help stoke partisan views. Dark money pools and various other funding entities on both sides of the aisle, they may see this as a trigger point to polarize votes. And while, yes, historically this is a disgusting aspect of our own American history, when you really think about it, for a long time now, Africa has been used as the charity case when politicians need to either paint the other party as bad for doing something wrong or raise their own clout. Data is mixed, but there's even some that have presented that this may be a proxy for gaining traction with the black vote. But with this, we're also going to begin to see more information being conveyed. And as with any data, more often than not, it's going to be presented with a bias, potentially leaving out the details that would otherwise kind of change the tune of the message. And this is going to occur on both sides, let me assure you. But before all that hits, I want to recommend that you watch a short 11-minute video from a actual famous YouTuber, Philip DeFranco. He has a kind of a news organization that he started called Rogue Rocket. And I think that they do an outstanding job of covering this particular China and Africa issue from many different angles and points of views and interpretations. I, for one, learned a lot from their comprehensive overview, and I think you will too. So I'm going to put the link in the description down below, but I also wanted to bring to your attention the investment implications here, and something that I think investors need to be aware and vigilant of. We're finding that, at least in the retail markets, the non-institutional investment markets, that investing is becoming more and more passive. Historically, emerging markets, they have presented investors with the potential for significant returns as compared to developed markets. But of course, this does come with an equal, if not greater, amount of potential risk that warrants this return. Oftentimes, when investors become more cautious or weary of the state of affairs with regard to the U.S. domestic markets, both stock and fixed income bond, they'll seek to place allocations in the international markets rather than flee solely to safety or solely to what they would consider to be safe investments like a cash or something that is virtually without risk in the investment sense. It's no secret that while sluggish and a heavily restricted market that it was for 8 to 10 years following the recession, the domestic markets have been in an uptrend for more than 11 years now. This is causing some investors to begin this allocation to other areas of the world in a kind of reactionary or kind of knee-jerk, but also in an indiscriminate fashion. Again, because of the passive nature of investing right now. People are buying just generic international index funds, and they think they're diversifying by buying a combination of, let's say, developed and underdeveloped or developed and emerging international funds. My word of caution for you is be very willing to take the time to understand the underlying attributes of your investments, be it in a 401k, IRA, traditional taxable brokerage account, whatever it is. You may find that you're unassumingly concentrating investments when you believe you're doing otherwise. You might see two different funds with different names, emerging versus international, and think, oh, if I buy a little of each of these, I'm going to get a diversification in my portfolio, so I'm going to theoretically reduce my risk. But again, like in a 401k, for example, it might be an actively managed fund, but get to know the attributes of these investments if that's a strategy that you seek out. So while investors are of the belief that they're diversifying, just right off the bat, China alone, it straddles the line of interpretation as to whether it falls in developed or emerging market classification. So then you add in the significance of the dependence via debt that a large number of African governments are placing on China, and the governments of these countries that are set to be some of the fastest growing economies in coming years, i.e. emerging markets with potential, you may find that these passive funds, both international developed and emerging international, are saturated with direct and indirect allocations to China and to the Chinese companies who are in turn under the control of, or at least closely aligned with, the Chinese government. And this occurs both on the equity side and the fixed income bond side of the capital markets. So that is something that you want to be aware of as an investor, buying some type of passive fund or something where you think you're achieving some sense of diversification when in fact you're really not. Keep that in mind. Be aware of that. That's just kind of let's say, a tip of the day. But finally, I'm also going to leave you with this one last thought to ponder. Considering we know that there's a vast influence that China is having on Africa right now, does it maybe come as a bit of a surprise that you haven't heard anything about the coronavirus spreading in Africa? Because to me, it's a bit troubling. And it also really makes you wonder not only about the information that's being shared to the public. Again, we've talked about that already, and the controlling the narrative, that type of thing. But it also really makes you a bit concerned about the types of influence that maybe China's having on these African governments in terms of bolstering their approach to limiting the information that's to be shared to the global marketplace. When you've got control over another country because of the debt that they owe you. We talked about a lot of the complications associated with looking at things as simply as that, especially as it comes to the United States. But when it comes to these smaller nations in Africa that have these pledges and these collateral engagements with the Chinese government, it wouldn't surprise me if there's a few phone calls going on in terms of let's not expose certain truths to the world for interpretation. Let's just keep this one kind of hush hush and close to the vest. And that again, very troubling for the people of these countries, very troubling to the freedom of information for people around the world to kind of peer into and better understand sort of what's going on elsewhere. But there's not a whole lot that each and every individual one of us can do, but collectively, if we're more aware of these things, we might be able to begin to change the tide or turn the tide. But being aware, being intelligent, being knowledgeable, it's a great place to start. Whew! All right, that finally wraps up this China series. Thank you so much for hanging in there and sticking with me while we explore these ideas. I look forward to seeing you all again soon. The last word I want to leave you with, go out, do something great today. It's as easy as just listening to somebody's differing point of view and taking the time to have some constructive dialogue with them. Use that uncommon sense. Be willing to embrace another person and their ideas and embrace the fact that they are allowed to have different ideas than you. Don't just get irate and storm off and throw a temper tantrum. the beauty of our country, the beauty of the American people and the American way, and the strength that we have as a country is because of our diversity. It's because of the difference in opinion, the difference in perspective that we have. We see horrific role models that we call politicians who, if we really boil it down, they're just looking for job security. They're looking to polarize us. It helps them make sure they keep their job. Our job as Americans is to stop giving so much power away to people who put their job first and our well-being as a society second. And these people who are touting things like socialism or democratic socialism, the hard truth of what these people are doing is baking into the system a means to ensure that they maintain power and control. But they're doing it under the guise of something that sounds so appealing to people who are uneducated and who don't actually have, again, what was common sense and it's now uncommon sense. So take the time to talk with people. Take the time to get to understand where they're coming from. You may help them see the world through a different lens, but they also may enlighten you to something that you weren't considering. And again, that's what makes this country so great. But until next time, bye-bye.